I've been a field correspondent for the Galactic Tribune for 22 years. I've covered the siege of Myra Station. I was in the press pool when the Vorthon Accord was signed. I watched the Dravki fleets pull out of the Keshin corridor with my own eyes, and I filed that story from a broken comm relay in the back of a cargo hauler that smelled like engine grease, and something I still don't want to identify. None of that prepared me for what I saw on Keljuroth IV. I've been sitting on this story for 8 months. Not because I was told to, not because anyone threatened me or bought my silence. I held it back because every time I tried to write it, the words came out wrong. Too dramatic, too impossible sounding. The kind of thing editors send back with a note that says, verify your sources, even when your source is your own 2 eyes, and a recording that you've watched 411 times. I counted 411 times. What I'm about to tell you happened. Every detail is accurate. I have the footage. I have the statements from 11 witnesses, 7 of whom are senior Galactic Defense Corps officers who still won't say it out loud in official settings because they don't know what to call it. I'm going to tell you what happened the day a child stopped the Warbeast. Not a trained handler, not a Neuralink specialist, not a xenobehavioral expert with 40 years of study behind them. A child, 7 years old, 23 kilograms, missing her 2 front teeth. She said one word, and the most dangerous living weapon in the known galaxy sat down. Chapter 1, the beast they made and could not unmake. Let me start with the Warbeast, because if you don't understand what it was, you won't understand why that moment broke something in the people who saw it. Its official designation was Subject Kael'Vorath Omega-9, but nobody called it that after the first 6 months. The handlers started calling it the Warbeast sometime during the 3rd operational cycle, and the name stuck the way bad names always do, because it was accurate. It was Vorthon bred, that matters. The Vorthon are the oldest militarized species in the known galaxy, not the most powerful, not the most technologically advanced, but the ones who have been at war the longest, who understand war the way other species understand agriculture or art. War is their culture, their architecture, the thing that shapes their cities and their children and their entire philosophy of existence. For 11,000 years, the Vorthon bred things for combat. The Warbeast was the end of that 11,000 years of work. I looked up the breeding records after Keljuroth. The project had taken 340 years and 67 generations of selective modification. 67 generations of choosing the strongest, the fastest, the most enduring, the most damage-resistant, and then pushing further, taking whatever was left after that and pushing again. By generation 12, the creature could survive impacts that would kill a standard combat vehicle. By generation 29, its metabolic system had been redesigned so that it could draw energy from almost any organic or semi-organic material in its environment. It didn't need rations. It didn't need a supply chain. It ate the battlefield. By generation 44, its nervous system had been restructured so that pain signals were processed differently, not suppressed, because suppressing pain makes you reckless and reckless things die, but rerouted. The Warbeast felt pain. It just didn't stop because of it. Pain became information rather than instruction. By generation 58, its cognitive architecture had been selectively enhanced in specific areas. Problem-solving, tactical adaptation, pattern recognition in combat environments, and something the Vorthon breeding documents called aggressive persistence, which was their clinical way of describing the fact that the Warbeast would not stop. Not for pain, not for exhaustion, not for the death of its assigned handlers. Not for anything short of the command sequence that Vorthon law required all combat-bred species to carry. A deep neurological override that could shut the creature down into a compliant state in under 12 seconds. The problem was that command sequence required 3 things: a Vorthon frequency vocal emission, a specific pheromone release from a Vorthon biological system, and direct skin contact transmission of a bioelectrical signal that was only producible by Vorthon nervous tissue. In other words, only a Vorthon could stop it. And the Vorthon who had bred Omega-9 and his 4 predecessors in the operational lineage were dead. Killed during the Keshin corridor conflict 4 years before the story I'm telling you. Their genetics were archived. Their pheromone profiles were cataloged. But the living bearers of that command capability were gone. The Galactic Defense Corps had inherited the Warbeast through the Keshan Annexation Treaty, without fully understanding what they were inheriting. By the time they did understand it, the Warbeast was already aboard a GDC facility ship, already in a containment cell that was rated for heavy armored vehicles, and already demonstrating that it found the cell somewhat more challenging than a suggestion, but somewhat less challenging than an actual barrier. The cell held, barely, and only because Vorthon construction materials are built to the same philosophy as Vorthon combat doctrine, maximum, redundant, unforgiving force. For 2 years, the GDC tried to solve the control problem. They brought in xenobehavioral specialists, 3 separate teams from 3 different academic institutions, all of them publishing papers in journals I'll never have the clearance to read. They tried synthetic pheromone replication. They tried Neuralink technology, inserting control interfaces directly into the creature's cognitive pathways. They tried acoustic override systems that could replicate Vorthon vocal frequencies. The Warbeast destroyed the Neuralink hardware, not by accident. It located each interface point with what the medical team described as disturbing precision and removed them one by one over a period of weeks, working around the sedation schedules, waiting until the monitoring cycles had gaps, and then methodically dismantling the technology with the patience of something that had nowhere to be and nothing to lose. The acoustic system it ignored. The frequencies were close but not exact, and the Warbeast knew the difference. The xenobehaviorists wrote in their reports that this suggested a level of sensory discrimination they hadn't accounted for. The thing could tell a synthetic copy from the real signal. The synthetic pheromone project came closest. They got the profile to 94% accuracy before the project lead was reassigned, and funding was redirected to a different initiative. 94%, it turned out, was exactly enough accuracy to make the Warbeast more agitated, not less. As if proximity to the familiar signal without the full signal was an insult the creature registered and resented. So when the GDC deployed the Warbeast to Kel'Jarath IV, it was not under control. That's the part of this story that I think about the most. When I go back through my notes from the pre-deployment briefings, when I read the official communiques from that period, there is this careful language. This measured, bureaucratic phrasing that says things like partially integrated operational asset and context-managed behavioral profile and handler-supervised deployment envelope. What that language meant, translated into honest words, was we cannot stop it. We can point it. We can give it a direction and release it and hope that it exercises the tactical judgment its cognitive architecture provides, because beyond that, we have no mechanism of control. They had a weapon they couldn't put down, and they used it anyway. Chapter 2, Kel'Jarath IV. The ground IT was meant for. Kel'Jarath IV is a mining world. That's the first thing you need to know about it, not the political situation, the geography, because the geography is what matters for this story. It's a mid-tier planet in the Dorothian system, which sits at the intersection of 3 trade routes that the Yexari separatist movement had been using for 18 months to funnel weapons, materials, and personnel into their conflict zones. The GDC had been trying to cut those routes for almost 2 years, and they kept failing because Kel'Jarath's surface is, and I'm using the military assessment word here, nightmarish. The planet's crust is primarily ferrous rock, highly magnetized, which makes most sensor technology unreliable at ground level. It has a thick atmosphere with significant particulate content from the mining operations. Centuries of industrial extraction have filled the air with fine metallic dust that drifts in visible clouds and reflects energy-based detection systems back at themselves. Visibility varies from about 200 meters on a good day to essentially 0 during the dust storms, which happen with some frequency given the wind patterns around the major excavation sites. The Yexari had been operating out of a network of old mine shafts that went down 6 levels beneath the surface. The GDC had spent 4 months trying to clear those shafts with standard infantry tactics and losing people every week. The shafts were designed to be defensible. The old mining company had built blast doors at every junction to contain cave-in debris, and those doors turned every corridor into a kill box. The decision to deploy the Warbeast was made by someone whose name I know, but won't print. I'll say only that the decision came from above the tactical level. It came from the kind of altitude where individual lives are units of calculation rather than irreducible facts. The Warbeast was transported to Keljuroth IV in a modified freight container with Vorthon-grade containment panels on the interior. The exterior looked like any other cargo container. Nobody who saw it offloaded at the Keljuroth orbital station would have known what was inside. I was at the station as part of the press pool. We had been told we were covering the Phase 3 of the Keljuroth clearance operation. We had not been told what Phase 3 involved. I saw the freight container come off the transport. I didn't think anything of it. That's the thing about not knowing something. You can be standing right next to the most consequential thing happening in the room and not know it because you don't know what to look for. Chapter 3, Night Before the Operation. The GDC forward operating base on Keljuroth IV was called Foxhound. It wasn't foxes, and it wasn't hounds. Those were Earth animals that the human contingent of the GDC had imported into their vocabulary for base naming. And the convention had spread through the core the way human vocabulary always spread, which was comprehensively and without asking anyone's permission. Foxhound was built into an abandoned processing facility about 12 kilometers north of the main Yexari-held mine network. The processing facility had been out of operation for 11 years, ever since the mining corporation that owned it had restructured and moved its operations to a newer, more profitable location. The buildings were intact, heavy industrial construction, built to last, but everything useful had been stripped out. What remained were large, empty spaces that the GDC had filled with the equipment of a forward operation. There were maybe 600 personnel at Foxhound: GDC infantry, support staff, a medical team, the tactical command group, a small contingent of what the official roster listed as behavioral asset integration specialists. Those were the people assigned to the Warbeast, and our press pool of 4 journalists. I'd been on the ground for 3 days before the operation began, and I spent most of those 3 days doing what journalists do when they're waiting for something to happen, talking to people. The infantry talked the way infantry always talks, which is specifically and practically about things that matter and not at all about things that don't. They talked about the Yexari defensive setup in the shafts. They talked about blast door configurations and how the Yexari had jury-rigged sensor systems in the tunnels to give them advance warning. They talked about the weather patterns and when the dust storms typically hit. They didn't talk about the Warbeast, not directly, but I noticed something in those 3 days. I noticed that the freight container, which I still didn't know the contents of, had been moved to a reinforced section of the facility, a section that the infantry wasn't using. And I noticed that when conversations came near the topic of what exactly the behavioral asset integration team was integrating, there was a particular kind of silence that fell. Not the silence of classified information, which has a specific quality, a slight stiffening, a deliberate change of subject. This was a different silence, the silence of people who knew something and didn't quite know what to do with knowing it. On the second day, I met Sergeant Major Orvan Tesek, who was the senior non-commissioned officer for the 14th GDC Infantry Contingent, which was the human majority unit that had been taking the highest casualties in the tunnel operations. Tesek was Kethani-born, which means his homeworld has 1.4 standard gravity, and he'd been growing up under that gravity his whole life, and you could see it in the way he was built. Broad through the chest and shoulders, carrying muscle that had developed over decades of existing in conditions that required more of a body. He had a gray-brown complexion and 4 fingers on each hand, Kethani anatomy, and the kind of eyes that have seen enough that they've settled into a permanent state of assessment. He sat down across from me during the evening meal period on the second day and said, without any preamble, "You're going to see something tomorrow or the day after that you're not going to know how to write about." I said, "That happens more often than you'd think." He said, "Not like this." I asked him what he meant. He didn't answer for almost a full minute, just looked at his food like it had done something to offend him. Then he said, "I've been in the Corps for 27 years. I've seen things that you'd think would be the limit. You think after 27 years you understand what the limit is, what the outer edge of the possible is." He shook his head. "The thing in that container, that thing is past the limit." I asked him if he'd seen it. "Briefing footage," he said. "Operational records from the Keshen deployment." I asked him what it had done in the Keshen deployment. He said what it was made to do. And then he was done talking about it. He finished his meal and left, and the next time I saw him was during the operation, and by then the conversation felt like it belonged to a different version of the world. That night, the night before the operation, there was a child at Foxhound. I need to explain how that came about because it sounds wrong. A forward military base on an active conflict world is not a place for children. But Keljuroth IV's civilian population hadn't been fully evacuated. The mining communities on the northern end of the planet, far from the active conflict zones, were still occupied. And about a week before I arrived, a vehicle transporting 3 civilian families who were attempting to reach the evacuation station had broken down 12 kilometers south of Foxhound and been found by a GDC patrol. The adults, 2 parents with their daughter, another family of 3 who were distant relatives, and 2 older siblings traveling alone, had been brought to Foxhound as a temporary measure while their transport situation was arranged. They were supposed to be there for 48 hours. The transport arrangement had taken longer than expected. By the time I was at Foxhound on day 2, the civilian group had been there for 5 days. The child's name was Mara Voss, 7 years old, a human child born on Keljuroth IV, which meant she'd spent her entire life on a mining world, and had that particular quality that children from working planets have, a practical unself-consciousness, an absence of the assumption that the world should be arranged around her comfort. She had dark hair cut straight across her forehead, brown eyes, and she was missing her 2 front teeth, which gave her speech a slight whistle when she hit her S sounds. She had found me on my first day, the way children on military bases find journalists, which is with complete confidence that you're going to be interesting to them. She sat down across from me while I was reviewing my notes and announced that her name was Mara and that she was 7 and that there was a dog on this base. There wasn't a dog on the base. I had not seen any animals. She said not a real dog, but there's something like a dog. I assumed she meant one of the GDC's working animals. Some units still deployed biological scouts, trained creatures from various species that had been domesticated and trained for tracking or early warning. I made a mental note to look into it and went back to my notes. She sat across from me for another 3 minutes in comfortable silence, and then she went away. I saw her around the base over the next 2 days. She was one of those children who seemed to generate space around themselves without trying, not because she was demanding or disruptive, but because she had a kind of gravity, the way some people do, that made you aware of where she was in a room. She talked to the infantry soldiers with the same easy confidence she'd shown with me. She helped carry things when people were moving equipment, because she'd grown up in a community where you helped carry things when people were moving equipment. She ate her meals and stayed out of the restricted areas without needing to be told twice. She asked questions. Constant, precise, unself-conscious questions. Not the performative questions that adults sometimes use as conversation starters. Real questions, the kind where she was actually waiting for the answer. On the evening of the second day, she asked me, "What's in the big container?" I said I didn't know. She said, "It smells different from all the other things here." I asked her what it smelled like. She thought about it seriously, then she said, "Like a storm, like before it rains." I didn't know what to do with that, so I didn't do anything with it. Chapter 4, the operation begins. The operation started at 300 hours, local time. The press pool was positioned at an observation point 400 meters from the main shaft entrance, far enough back to be outside the immediate tactical footprint, close enough to see the shaft entrance and the approaches to it. We had limited communications equipment, and we were under explicit orders not to transmit anything until the operational security window lifted, which would be at the discretion of the tactical command. The 14th contingent went in first. Infantry in full combat kit, the heavy suits that the GDC issues for enclosed environment operations, which add about 30 kilograms to the wearer's effective mass and provide protection against the kind of weapons the Yexari had been using in the tunnels. I watched them go in. Tesek was with them, moving at the back of the formation the way senior NCOs do, not leading from the front, but present, watching, adjusting. For 40 minutes, nothing came back to us at the observation point except radio traffic, which we could monitor but not record. The tactical command group was in a mobile command post 200 meters to our left. I could see the lights from their displays through the transparent sections of the command post structure, and I could see the figures moving inside, the shifting postures that communicate tension even at a distance. At 3:41, the radio traffic changed. I've been in enough operational situations to read radio traffic without hearing the words clearly. The tempo changes. The intervals between transmissions shorten. The transmission lengths change, longer acknowledgments when things are going smoothly, shorter when they're not. At 3:41, the traffic shifted from the measured cadence of an operation in progress to something faster, more compressed, the verbal equivalent of a shortened breath. Something had gone wrong in the tunnels. I learned later what it was. The Yexari had an additional blast door that hadn't appeared on the shaft schematics. A newer installation, added in the last 6 months, positioned at a junction that was now effectively trapping the leading element of the 14th contingent on the wrong side. The door was Vorthon grade, because the Yexari had been buying surplus Vorthon military hardware on the secondary market and using it throughout their defensive infrastructure. Vorthon-grade blast doors don't open unless you open them from the inside or you have weapons that can compromise Vorthon-grade construction. The 14th didn't have those weapons underground. The weapons were topside. Which is when someone in the tactical command group made the decision. I didn't know at 3:41 that this decision had been made. What I knew was that the radio traffic was changing again, not shorter and faster, but different. A different kind of intensity. And then the lights in the command post shifted as people moved, and then there was movement across the ground between the command post and the reinforced section of the facility. 4 figures moving quickly. And then the reinforced section's outer door opened, and then there was a sound. I need to be honest about what that sound was like. I've been trying to describe it accurately for 8 months, and I keep not quite getting there. It was low, very low below the frequencies that are purely auditory, in the range that your body feels before your ears process it. It was also not uniform. It had a texture to it, a quality of many components overlapping, like a piece of machinery that is operating at extreme output levels. And it had a quality that I can only describe by saying that it was the sound of something that doesn't make concessions. There's nothing apologetic about the sound a Warbeast makes. Nothing that says I'm just passing through or please excuse me. It's a sound that says, I am here, and here is a fact about the universe that you now have to deal with. The ground shook. Not dramatically, not like an earthquake, but a perceptible vibration through the soles of my boots transmitted through the ferrous rock of Kel'Juroth IV's crust that told me the thing making that sound had mass. Substantial, unapologetic geological mass. My press pool colleague, a Sindari journalist named Veth Olarik, whose composure I had come to regard as effectively unshakable in the 3 years we'd worked adjacent to each other, reached out and put her hand on my arm. She didn't say anything, she just held my arm. I looked over at her and her 3 eyes, Sindari have 3, arranged in a vertical configuration, were all tracking the same direction, toward the reinforced section. Veth, I said quietly. I know, she said. You've seen the briefing materials. Yes, she said. How bad? Don't ask me that right now, she said. Just watch. Chapter 5, the WRBSD of Kel'Juroth. It came out of the reinforced section through a door that had been modified to accommodate its dimensions, and even with the modification, it had to angle itself slightly to clear the frame. I was 400 meters away. In the dust-filtered darkness of a Kel'Juroth night, under the blue-white light of the portable illumination rigs the GDC had set up around the operational perimeter. And even at 400 meters in low light, through particulate haze, I understood immediately and completely what Sergeant Major Tessek had meant when he said the thing was past the limit. The Warbeast stood approximately 4 meters at the shoulder. Not 4 meters tall, 4 meters at the shoulder, which was the highest point of its body when it was in what I would have to call its resting posture, which is the posture it was in when it emerged because it was still in the process of orienting, still taking in the new environment. When it moved into full operational posture, stretching out, the shoulder height dropped slightly and the horizontal extension increased. The overall shape was bipedal adjacent. 2 primary limbs at the front, 2 at the rear, but the classification of legs and arms didn't quite apply because all 4 limbs were structurally designed to function as primary locomotion surfaces. It could move on all 4 or on 2. When it moved on two, the front limbs came up and the movement became something that looked, from a distance, almost like running, until you realized the speed was wrong. Things that are shaped like running things don't move that fast on two limbs, not at that size. The physics don't work. The Vorthon had apparently solved the physics problem. Its surface was covered in overlapping plates, not external armor, not something added, but integumental structure that had been bred into it over 67 generations. The plates were biological tissue, dense and mineralized, a dark color that shifted between deep gray and deep green depending on the angle of the light. They weren't uniform. They were asymmetric in ways that, the xenobiology papers I later read explained, were not accidental. The asymmetry provided specific mechanical advantages at different impact angles, distributing force in ways that no symmetric design could replicate. The head was smaller relative to the body than you'd expect. Vorthon breeding had optimized the cognitive architecture for size efficiency. The neural structures that mattered for combat function were compact and protected, housed in a cranial structure that angled backward from a forward-facing sensory cluster. The sensory cluster, I won't call it a face because it wasn't a face in any recognizable sense, was a dense array of overlapping sensory organs, each specialized. The Warbeast could perceive in ranges that included standard visual frequencies, thermal output, pressure differentials, chemical signatures, and electromagnetic field variations. At close range, it could read bioelectrical output, heartbeats, nervous system activity, the galvanic shifts that stress produces in living tissue. It could smell fear. Biologically, literally, it could smell fear. It stood there for a moment, maybe 6 seconds, and in those 6 seconds it did something that the xenobehavioral reports describe as environmental scanning, but which, watching it, felt like something else. It felt like the creature was taking inventory, making a list of everything present in its operational environment, categorizing each element, assigning each element a position in whatever internal priority structure governed its attention. Then it moved toward the mine shaft entrance, and the handlers who were moving with it, 4 of them in heavy suits, carrying systems that I now understood were not control systems but management systems, systems designed to influence direction and keep the creature broadly oriented toward its assigned objective rather than actually stop or command it. Those handlers moved with it but not quite alongside it. They were in the gap between accompanying and following. Close enough to affect the creature's assessment of its environment, not close enough to be in its direct path. The Warbeast moved across the ground between the reinforced section and the mine shaft entrance in 93 seconds. I know it was 93 seconds because I timed it. The entrance was a structure of Vorthon-grade panels over a shaft opening approximately 6 meters across. The Warbeast assessed it for perhaps 2 seconds. Then it reached forward with one of its front limbs, and the limb ended in a structure that combined the functions of hand and weapon, multi-jointed, dense, capable of precision manipulation and structural destruction with equal facility, and it began to work on the entrance structure. I use the word work deliberately. It wasn't random destruction, it was methodical. It identified the load-bearing elements of the structure. It applied force at specific points in a specific sequence, and the entrance structure came apart in a way that opened the shaft rather than collapsed it. It had analyzed the engineering of the structure in 2 seconds, and dismantled it correctly in about 40. Then it went into the shaft, and the sounds that came up from the ground for the next 11 minutes were the sounds of a war underground, and I cannot describe them to you in a way that would serve any useful purpose, so I won't try. Chapter 6, What Came Back. The trapped element of the 14th contingent came out of the shaft 30 minutes after the Warbeast went in. They came up the main shaft in 2 groups, moving fast, in the particular way that people move when they have just been in a situation they needed to not be in anymore, and the not being in it has only just become possible. Not panicking. Infantry doesn't panic, but with an urgency that was physical and immediate and visible. Tesek was with the first group. He came up out of the shaft, and he came out with a different posture than the one he did going in. Not injured, I checked, and he wasn't, but different, like something had been rearranged in him. He walked past the observation point without looking at us, and then he stopped about 30 meters past us and just stood there for a moment, and then he sat down on the ground. Sergeant Major Tesek, 27 years in the GDC, sat down on the ground in the middle of an active operation and put his head in his 4-fingered hands. I've thought about that a lot in the 8 months since. The full 14th contingent was accounted for within 45 minutes of the operation's commencement. All personnel alive. Casualties were lighter than any previous tunnel operation, 3 injuries, none critical. The objective was achieved. The Yexari defensive network in the primary shaft complex was, according to the after-action report, neutralized. I've read that after-action report. That word, neutralized, is doing a lot of work. The Warbeast came back up out of the shaft 62 minutes after it went in. I expected it to come out the way it went in. Moving purposefully, controlled, operational. It came out different. Not injured. The xenobehavioral team checked it extensively over the following hours, and it had sustained what the team's report called minor integumental abrasion in a few locations, which was apparently the equivalent of a light scratch. The Yexari had brought everything they had to bear on it in those tunnels, and the result was minor integumental abrasion. But it came out of the shaft with something in its behavior that the handlers weren't prepared for. It came out of the shaft, and it didn't stop moving in the direction it had been moving. It emerged from the shaft and kept going, past the shaft, past the perimeter markers, into the open ground beyond the operational perimeter, and it moved with a quality that I can only describe as restless, like something had been started in it down in those tunnels that hadn't finished yet. The handlers followed, keeping their distance, using the directional systems they had, the systems that could influence but not command. The Warbeast moved in a broad arc around the perimeter of the Foxhound facility, not attacking, not targeting, moving. And as it moved, the sensors that the facility had, perimeter sensors, environmental monitors, the biological detection systems that every military installation has to track the health and status of personnel, those sensors started producing readings. The readings were agitation indicators, the biometric profile of something that was running too hot, something that had been activated and was still activated and didn't have an off switch. The xenobehavioral team's lead specialist, a Carthani woman named Dr. Sevriome, who I later interviewed extensively, and who was one of the 11 witnesses I mentioned at the beginning, came out of the facility and walked toward the Warbeast's arc of movement with the specific kind of controlled calm that people use when they're frightened and know that showing it will make things worse. She told me later that she'd tried the directional systems. She'd tried the acoustic systems. She'd tried the highest accuracy synthetic pheromone formulation they had aboard. It was like talking to a storm, she said. You can say the words, it doesn't matter. The Warbeast's arc tightened. It started moving in a smaller circle. The restlessness was concentrating. This is the part of the story where things stopped following the pattern that trained people expected. The handlers had protocols for this. The protocols were increase distance, maintain observation, wait for the acute phase to subside. The theory was that after a high-intensity engagement, the creature's nervous system would eventually self-regulate and the acute activation state would reduce. The theory was based on models. The models were based on the earlier generations in the breeding line, which were smaller and less cognitively developed and had shorter and more predictable post-engagement cycles. The Warbeast was Generation 67. The models were wrong. It had been in that high activation state for 31 minutes and it was not subsiding. It was increasing. The handlers fell back to 40 meters. The facility personnel who were outdoors moved inside. The 14th contingent, who had just come out of the tunnels and were in various states of decompression from that experience, got word through their communication systems and moved to the fortified sections of the facility. The tactical command group went to a higher alert status. The press pool was told, by a GDC public affairs officer who came to us with impressive composure, given the circumstances, that we should probably move to the interior shelter positions. We moved. I was in the interior shelter position, watching through the facility's external monitoring displays, when Mara Voss walked past me toward the facility's main door. Chapter 7, The Child Who Walked Toward It. I want to be careful here. I want to be very careful here. Because what I'm about to describe is the part that people have the hardest time with. The part that makes the skeptical readers, and there are always skeptical readers, decide I'm exaggerating or misremembering or constructing a narrative after the fact to give meaning to something that was just chaos. I was watching the monitoring displays. The Warbeast's movement was visible on the thermal imaging system, a massive, intensely warm signature moving in the tightening arc I described. The handlers were visible at the edge of the display range, stationary, maintaining distance. I saw Mara Voss walk past me. I registered it as a background event, a child moving through a space. My attention was on the displays. Then something shifted in my peripheral processing. The thing that journalists develop over time, the ability to catch things that aren't right without being able to immediately articulate what isn't right about them. And I looked at where she was going. She was going toward the door. I said, "Mara." She didn't stop. I said louder, "Mara, stay inside." She stopped, she turned and looked at me with those brown eyes that were always assessing something. "The dog is scared," she said. And then she turned back and kept walking toward the door. I called to the public affairs officer. I called to 2 soldiers who were near the door. By the time anyone moved with enough purpose to intercept her, she had already palmed the door panel and the door was cycling open. The door opened. Mara Voss walked through it. 3 things happened simultaneously. The public affairs officer called it in on her communication system. The 2 soldiers moved toward the door. And I can't fully explain this decision, except that I had been a journalist for 22 years, and something in me recognized that I was watching a moment. I followed. I went through the door about 6 seconds after Mara did. The scene outside was this. The blue-white lights of the perimeter illumination rigs were still up. The particulate in the air was catching the light and creating halos. The sky above was the particular dark amber of Keljuroth's night sky, heavy with atmospheric content. The mine shaft entrance was dark. The structure the Warbeast had dismantled still collapsed around it. And 30 meters from the facility's main door, in the open ground between the door and the perimeter line, the Warbeast was. It had stopped its arc. It had stopped because Mara was walking toward it. I know that's why it stopped, because of the footage. The timing is unambiguous. The thermal signature stops its circular motion at the precise moment the door opens, and Mara's much smaller thermal signature appears on the display. The creature stopped because something new had entered its environment, something that didn't match any of the categories it had been moving through. I don't know what category Mara Voss occupied in the Warbeast's internal taxonomy. I've thought about it for 8 months. I've read everything the xenobehavioral team has published about it, and they've been thinking about it too, and they don't know either. Their best current theory is that the sensory profile of a child, the bioelectrical output, the specific chemical signature, the particular combination of vocal frequencies, behavioral markers, body language, was simply outside the operational parameters the creature had been built for. It had been built to exist in a world of threats and non-threats, and Mara didn't register as either. She was something else, something the 67 generations hadn't accounted for. She walked toward it. I was behind her, about 15 meters back, and the soldiers were behind me, and none of us were moving to intercept her now. I can't speak for the soldiers. I can speak for myself. I didn't intercept her because I could see the Warbeast's posture, and something in the posture was different from everything I'd seen on the monitoring displays for the last hour. It was still, genuinely still, not the calculated stillness of something gathering itself to move. The stillness of something that has stopped and is trying to understand what it's stopping for. Mara walked to within 15 meters of it. The Warbeast lowered its head. That sensory cluster, the dense arrangement of overlapping organs that the xenobehavioral team calls the anterior sensory apparatus, oriented toward her. At 15 meters, it was receiving her full biometric profile. Everything the creature could perceive, it was perceiving. Mara stopped. She looked up at it. I cannot tell you what she was thinking. I can tell you what she looked like from where I was standing. She looked like a child who had gone to look at a dog that was having a hard time. That's what she looked like. There was no bravado in it, no performance. No awareness, apparently, that she was doing something that would be considered impossible by every expert who had spent years trying to solve the problem she was standing in front of. She just looked at it. The Warbeast looked at her. 15 meters between them. The particulate in the air drifted through the illumination light. The perimeter sensors were still recording. The monitoring displays inside the facility were still running. The handlers were at 40 meters behind the Warbeast, stationary. The public affairs officer was talking into her communication system in a rapid, compressed voice. Somewhere in the facility, people were watching the monitoring displays and not breathing. Myra Voss said one word. She said, "Sit." Chapter 8, the word "and" what followed. It came out with a whistle through her missing front teeth that her S sounds always had. That small acoustic imperfection that was specific to her age, to the particular gap in her dentition. A child's voice in the dark of Keljuroth IV saying the most ordinary thing in the universe. "Sit." The Warbeast sat. Not immediately. There was a pause. Dr. Ohm's analysis puts it at approximately 2.3 seconds, based on the footage. 2.3 seconds in which the creature was processing something. And then the front limbs folded and the body lowered, and the massive integumental mass of the thing settled toward the ground in a motion that was, I swear to you, careful, deliberate. The way you move when you're trying not to frighten something small. It sat. The handlers would tell me later that they had never, in the operational record of Omega-9, in all the footage from the Keshen deployment, in all 2 years of facility observation, seen the Warbeast sit. Not like this, not in response to anything external. The creature's behavioral repertoire, as documented, did not include sitting in response to a stimulus. It included standing, moving, engaging, resting, and a specific defensive crouch posture that it used when facing incoming fire. It didn't include this. What it included now, apparently, was whatever Myra Voss had just produced in it. I stood there with my boots on Keljuroth IV's Ferrous Rock, and I watched the most dangerous thing in the known galaxy sit down for a 7-year-old child, and I felt something shift inside me that I still haven't fully mapped. It wasn't just that she'd stopped it. The handlers had sometimes, temporarily, stopped it with the directional systems. Not reliably, not sustainably, but they had managed it. It was the how. It was the complete and uncomplicated quality of the response. There was no struggle in it, no resistance that had been overcome. The creature didn't sit the way a thing sits when it's been forced into compliance. It sat the way a thing sits when sitting makes sense to it. It sat and it looked at Myra. Myra looked back at it. After maybe 10 seconds, she walked forward. She walked from 15 meters to 5 meters, and she stopped again, and she reached out her hand. The hand of a 7-year-old child, extended toward the sensory cluster of a 4-meter combat organism bred across 67 generations to be the most effective weapon a civilization with 11,000 years of military science could produce. The Warbeast lowered its head further. The anterior sensory apparatus came within 20 centimeters of her extended hand. And then it made a sound. Not the sound I'd heard when it came out of the reinforced section. That sound had been the sound of something fully operational, fully activated, the output of a system running at high intensity. This sound was something different, lower, less complex. A single resonant frequency that came from somewhere deep in the creature's thorax and emerged through what I would have to call its throat, though the anatomy is entirely unlike anything I understand. The xenobehavioral team's audio analysis describes this vocalization as belonging to a category they had never previously observed in Omega-9's behavioral record. They spent 3 weeks trying to find a match in the Vorthon breeding documentation. They found one reference. Generation 14. 67 generations back in the breeding line before the modifications had been pushed past a certain threshold. Generation 14 of the Warbeast's lineage had produced, apparently, a vocalization in this frequency and character in 2 documented contexts. The first context was what the Vorthon breeding records called territorial settlement. The sound the creature made when it had determined that it was in a location where it did not need to fight. The second context was one that the Vorthon breeding records spent 3 lines on and didn't elaborate further. The records called it presence acknowledgement. The note beside it in the original Vorthon documentation said, produced in response to non-threat contact of unfamiliar type. Function unclear, not a combat behavior, does not persist beyond contact duration. They had documented it. And then, by Generation 20 and the deepening of the military modifications, the vocalization had apparently disappeared from the behavioral record. The creature had been optimized past whatever produced it. 67 generations later, standing 5 meters from a child on Uroth IV with the dust of the mining operations drifting through the illumination light. It produced it again. Presence acknowledgement. Whatever Myra Voss was, the Warbeast was acknowledging it. Chapter 9, What the Watchers Saw. Inside the facility, on the monitoring displays, the people watching were not speaking. I've collected 11 accounts of that moment from people who were watching the displays. Tesek, who was on his feet again by then and had made his way to a display terminal. Dr. Ohm, who was outside at 40 meters and watched without a display because she was already out there. The Tactical Command Group's senior officer, Commander HFY Voss, no relation to Mara, who was watching from the command post. The Public Affairs officer, who was watching while still talking into her communication system until the moment she stopped talking and just watched, and 7 others. None of them spoke for approximately 90 seconds. Tesek told me, I've spent 27 years believing there's an explanation for everything if you know enough, that the universe is complicated but it's not magic. It's just physics and biology and the things that happen when you put enough force against enough resistance. He shook his head. 90 seconds watching that child standing next to that thing, and I didn't know what I believed anymore. I didn't know which category that was in. Complicated but explainable or something else. Dr. Ohm told me, I'm a scientist. I will find an explanation. I've been working on the explanation for 8 months, and I have good data, and I think I understand the mechanism. But in those 90 seconds, standing there watching it, it didn't feel like a mechanism. It felt like something from outside the system. She paused. I know that's not a scientific thing to say. I'm saying it anyway. Commander HFY Voss told me, in the most carefully official language of all 11 witnesses, the engagement of Subject Omega-9 by the civilian miner produced an outcome inconsistent with all prior behavioral projections and all operational models in our current database. The event has been classified as a significant anomaly and is the subject of ongoing analysis. Then she stopped using official language and said, she told it to sit, and it sat. I don't have a box to put that in. The public affairs officer, who asked me not to use her name, and whose professional obligation to official messaging I completely understand, told me off the record. I have seen a lot of things in this job that I filed under wait and understand later. That one is still waiting. Chapter 10, After the Sitting. Mara spent 40 minutes with the Warbeast that night. She didn't stay at 5 meters the whole time. She moved closer, at whatever pace seemed to make sense to her, which is to say she moved at the pace of a child following her own judgment. By the 20-minute mark, she was close enough to touch the creature's anterior sensory apparatus, and she did touch it, an open palm contact against the ridged edge of the sensory cluster. A gesture so matter-of-fact that the people watching the displays didn't realize what they were seeing for a moment because the scale was wrong. Her hand was so small relative to what it was touching that the monitoring system's image interpretation algorithms initially flagged it as a sensor artifact. The Warbeast held still for the contact. Not passively, the sensory cluster oriented toward the contact. The creature was leaning into it in the limited way that its anatomy and posture allowed for leaning. Not much, but enough to be visible on the thermal display, where the massive warm signature shifted its center of gravity slightly toward the small cool point of contact that was Mara's hand. Dr. Ohm told me later that this was the moment she started genuinely crying, which she reported with scientific detachment and a complete lack of embarrassment. I was watching a 40,000-kilogram apex predator that has no neurological framework for gentle contact lean into the touch of a 7-year-old. And yes, I cried. Anyone who wouldn't cry watching that has either never seen it or has something wrong with them. Mara talked to it, quietly. At 5 meters, I couldn't hear the words, and at 20 meters, the soldiers behind me couldn't hear them either. The vocal sensors on the perimeter monitoring picked up some fragments. The acoustic analysis isn't complete as of this writing, but the sections that have been processed show her speaking in a conversational register, the same tone she used when asking me questions about my notebook. Not baby talk, not commands, conversation. She named it. I know she named it because she said the name loud enough that Dr. Ohm heard it at 40 meters. She told me the name was Kale, not because she knew the creature's official designation, she didn't, because it sounded right to her. Kale. She named the Warbeast Kale. And when she said that name, the vocalization changed. Not dramatically, not a roar or a sudden shift. just a minor modulation in the resonant frequency that the monitoring system's acoustic analysis picked up, and that Dr. Ohm and the behavioral team spent 6 weeks trying to characterize. They characterized it eventually as a response to a unique identifier. In plain language, the creature responded to its name, not the designation Omega-9, which it had been called for years and which had produced no consistent behavioral response in the documented record. The name Mara had given it in that 40 minutes on Keljuroth IV. Kale. At the 40-minute mark, a GDC officer who I will not name made a decision that I consider, looking back, to have been the most significant error of judgment in this entire sequence of events. The officer decided that the situation had stabilized sufficiently for a controlled extraction of the child from the animal's proximity. The extraction team that came out of the facility was 6 soldiers, in full combat kit, moving in a tactical formation that was designed for handling situations involving potentially dangerous entities. It was, tactically speaking, the correct formation for the situation as it had been briefed. The problem was that the situation had changed. The extraction team came out of the facility and began moving toward Mara's position, and Mara saw them coming, and she said something to the Warbeast, to Kale, and then she turned toward the extraction team with an expression that the body camera footage shows as profoundly annoyed. She said, "He's okay. He's not going to hurt anyone." The extraction team stopped. They looked at each other in the way that people look at each other when the situation has gone somewhere their training didn't anticipate. Then one of the soldiers, I later found out his name was Corporal Doth Urson, a 22-year-old human from a coastal region of a planet called Thessaly, said, very carefully and very slowly, "We know. We just need you to come inside now, okay?" Mara looked at him. She looked at the formation behind him. She looked at the weapons they were carrying. She said, "He can tell you're scared of him. That's not fair." Corporal Urson stood there for a moment. Then he did something that the monitoring footage shows with perfect clarity. He reached up and engaged the clip on his shoulder-mounted sidearm and removed the weapon and placed it on the ground behind him. Then he stood up straight and walked forward without the formation, without the tactical posture, just a young man walking across open ground toward a child. He crouched down next to Mara and said something I couldn't hear. She considered it. Then she turned back to Kale and said, and this I heard clearly because she said it at the volume of a child who wanted to make sure she was heard, "I'll come back tomorrow." She looked at the creature for another moment. Then she went with Corporal Urson, walking back toward the facility with that complete unself-consciousness that was her signature, as though she hadn't just done the thing that no one in the known galaxy had managed to do in 2 years of trying. Chapter 11, the morning after. Dawn on Keljuroth IV comes with a particular quality. The atmospheric particulate catches the first light differently than on worlds with cleaner air. There's a diffusion effect, a spreading of the light across the sky that makes the dawn gradual and amber-tinted, and somehow larger than dawn on a clearer world. It fills everything rather than arriving from a direction. I was awake before the dawn. I don't think I'd slept. I sat with my recorder and my notebook, and I looked at what I'd written during the night, which was extensive and incoherent, and would take me weeks to turn into anything printable. I've never had a night like that, not for coverage, not for analysis, not for professional preparation. I had a night of just sitting with something I'd seen and not knowing what to do with it. At 6:17, Mara Voss walked through the common area where I was sitting and said, "Good morning." I said good morning. She poured herself something to drink from the facility's provisions, one of the synthetic fruit flavor mixes that military installations keep for morale purposes, and which children apparently find acceptable, and she sat down across from me. I asked her if she'd slept. "Yes," she said. I asked her carefully if she'd been frightened last night. She thought about it, not to compose an answer that would sound good, actually thinking about it the way she thought about everything. "A little," she said, "at the beginning, but then not." I asked her why not. She said he was more scared than me. I looked at her. She said not like fear-scared, but like, she paused, searching for the word. Like when you're in a new place and nothing is what you know. Everything is strange and your body is doing things because of the strangeness. He was like that. I said, "How could you tell?" She said he smelled like before it rains. She finished her drink. She said he's going to be okay, you know. I asked her how she knew that. She said because someone talked to him like he was real. And then she got up and went to get breakfast, and I sat there with my recorder running and an empty room around me, and that sentence sitting in the air where she'd left it. Chapter 12, What the Xenobehavioral Team Found. Dr. Sevri Ohm spent the 6 hours after Mara went back inside taking readings on the Warbeast's biometric status. She did this from a safe distance, using the facility's sensor systems and her own portable monitoring equipment. She did not approach the creature. She observed. What she found was this: the acute activation state, the state that the creature had been in for the 31 minutes before Mara went outside, the state that had the handlers backing away to 40 meters, and the tactical command group going to higher alert, was gone. Not reduced, gone. The biometric profile the sensors were recording from the Warbeast in the hour after Mara went back inside was, according to Dr. Ohm's analysis, the calmest reading ever recorded from Omega-9 in any context. Calmer than the readings from when the creature was in its containment cell on the facility ship. Calmer than anything in the documented record from the Keshen deployment. I've looked at every biometric reading we have on that creature from the day we took custody of it, Dr. Ohm told me. 2 years of continuous monitoring, and the lowest activation state we'd ever recorded before last night was still substantially elevated from what we were seeing after that child went inside. She paused. That 40 minutes changed something, she said. Not because of what she did, not because of any specific action, because of what she was, what she brought with her. I asked her what she thought Mara had brought with her. Dr. Ohm said, no agenda, no fear that it recognized as a threat, no attempt to impose or control, just presence, contact, the kind of thing that thing had never experienced from anything outside its Vorthon handlers. She thought about it more. The Vorthon who bred it loved it in their way, she said. 67 generations of breeders who understood what they were making and why. They built mechanisms for control because control was necessary, but the foundation of those mechanisms was a relationship. A known relationship, a species-to-species familiarity that went back as many generations as the creature itself. When the Vorthon handlers died in Keshen, it wasn't just control that was lost. It was the only kind of relationship the creature had ever known. She paused. For 2 years, everything it encountered tried to control it, or was afraid of it, or both. She looked at me, and then a child walked up to it in the dark and talked to it like it was real. Chapter 13, The Days That Followed. The civilian transport situation was resolved 4 days after the operation. Mara's family and the other civilians at Foxhound were cleared for transport to the main evacuation station, and from there, they would reach the Civilian Resettlement Processing Center on Keljuroth's orbital station and eventually, a transport out of the system. In those 4 days, Mara went back to visit Kale every day. The GDC didn't stop her. I think they tried initially. There were discussions at the command level that I wasn't privy to, but the outcome of those discussions was that the monitoring system stayed active. 2 soldiers were posted at a respectful distance, and Mara went out in the morning and the afternoon and spent time with the creature that nobody else could approach within 40 meters. Dr. Ohm was present at a distance for every visit, monitoring, and recording. She told me these visits were the most professionally significant experiences of her career. She also told me, separately, that they were something else beyond professional significance, something she wasn't quite ready to articulate in scientific language. During the visits, Mara did the things that children do. She talked, she sat, she told stories. Apparently, the acoustic sensors picked up narrative-structured speech, the kind of cadence that stories have. She brought on the 3rd day a piece of food from the facility's provisions, one of the synthetic nutrient bars that GDC field rations include, and she offered it to Kale. The creature sniffed it carefully. It did not eat it, but it didn't retreat from it either, and the biometric monitors showed no threat response activation from the offering. It processed the item as a gesture rather than as a stimulus. Dr. Ohm thought that was significant. She's still writing about it. On the 4th day, 2 hours before the civilian transport was scheduled, Mara came to find me. She found me in the press area, where I was reviewing the recording and trying, for the 53rd time at that point, to write the opening of this story. She sat down across from me in the same chair she'd used every other time, with the same comfortable directness. She said, "Are you writing about Cale?" I said, trying to. She said, "He's going to be lonely when I leave." I said, "I think Dr. Ohm will take good care of him." She considered this. "Dr. Ohm is nice," she said, "but she's still scared. You can be nice and scared at the same time." She looked at me. "Can you tell them that he's not what they think he is?" I said, "What do you think he is?" She said, "Something that didn't get to be what it could have been. Something that just needs someone to not be afraid." She got up and went to pack her things. Chapter 14, The Departure. The transport came at 1400 hours. It was a standard GDC personnel shuttle, nothing special, the kind of vessel that moves people between ground installations and orbital stations all across the conflict zone. It landed on the pad outside Foxhound's main structure, and the civilian group gathered their things and moved toward it. Myra was with her parents. Her father was a quiet man with her same dark hair and a weathered look that spoke of years of work in industrial environments. Her mother was taller, lighter-eyed, the kind of person whose competence is visible in the economy of her movements. They both had the look of people who had understood what their daughter had done but not quite processed it yet. At the door of the transport, Myra stopped. She turned around and looked across the facility grounds toward the area where Cale had been positioned since the operation. He was visible. You couldn't miss a 4-meter combat organism even at several hundred meters, settled into a posture that the handlers had taken to calling his resting position, which was a position nobody had seen before the night Myra first went to him. She looked at him for a long moment. She raised her hand. The creature's anterior sensory apparatus oriented toward her. Then she got on the transport. The transport lifted at 1417. The Warbeast watched it go until it was out of sensory range. Sergeant Major Tesek was standing next to me when this happened. He watched the creature watch the transport lift. He said very quietly, "What do we do with this?" I said, "I don't know." He said, 27 years, I don't know either." The transport became a point of light, and then disappeared into the amber-colored sky of Keljuroth IV. Chapter 15, What the Report Said and Didn't Say. The official after-action report on the Keljuroth IV operation runs to 412 pages. I've read all of it. Most of it is the operational record, the shaft clearance, the personnel accounting, the equipment status, the strategic assessment of the Yexari defensive situation following the operation. The section about the Warbeast is 11 pages. Of those 11 pages, 9 are biometric data, tables, charts, comparative analyses of the activation state readings before and after the event. Science documented carefully and precisely. 1 page is Dr. Ohm's summary of the behavioral observations during the 4 days of civilian presence at Foxhound. 1 page is what the report calls Special Incident Assessment, Omega-9 Behavioral Anomaly, Keljuroth IV. The Special Incident Assessment runs to 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph describes the incident. The second paragraph notes that the incident has been referred to the Galactic Defense Corps Xenobehavioral Sciences Division for further analysis. The third paragraph states that the interaction between Omega-9 and the civilian miner Mara Voss produced behavioral outcomes that lie outside current predictive models and require model revision. 3 paragraphs, 412 pages of report, and the most important thing that happened on Keljuroth IV gets 3 paragraphs. I understand why. I've been doing this long enough to understand why. You can't put in an official military document that a child said 1 word and stop the most dangerous thing your corps has ever had to manage. You can't write that in the language that official documents are written in because the language doesn't have room for it. The language is built for things that fit in established categories, and this doesn't fit. But I've been sitting with this for 8 months, and I think not writing it correctly is a mistake. I think what happened on Keljuroth IV is one of the most important things I've witnessed in 22 years, and not because of the tactical outcome, not because of the strategic implications, not because of what it means for the GDC's management of Subject Omega-9 going forward. Because of what it means for the question we've been asking about ourselves ever since we met the rest of the universe. Chapter 16, the question we don't ask out loud. When humans joined the galactic community, and joined is a diplomatic word for a process that was considerably messier and more complicated and more contested than that word implies. One of the things that became apparent quickly was that the other species had a framework for understanding us that we didn't quite fit. Framework was built around the assumption that every species was ultimately defined by its survival adaptations, what it had evolved to do, what it was optimized for. The Kethani were optimized for high-gravity environments and had the physical capabilities that came with that. The Sindari were optimized for complex sensory processing and had the cognitive architectures that came from that. The Vorthon had been shaped by 11,000 years of war and had the culture and the biology that came with that. Humans didn't fit the framework neatly. We're not the strongest species. We're not the fastest. Our sensory range is quite limited by galactic standards. Our technology was, at the point of first contact, reasonably advanced but not exceptional. In terms of the metrics that the galactic community had established for evaluating species capability, we were middle of the table at best. What the other species kept noticing, and what became the subject of extensive academic and scientific literature that I've spent considerable time reading since Keljuroth, was something harder to categorize. Humans bond with things, not just with each other and not just with our own species. We bond with everything. Dogs and cats, obviously, the long history of animal domestication that the Vorthon and several other species found fascinating and then alarming as they understood its scope. But not just domestic animals, horses that we ride, birds that we train, fish in containers in our homes, plants that we name and talk to. Environments, rivers and mountains and particular stretches of shoreline, that humans form attachments to that function similarly to the attachments we form with living things. There's a paper by a Sindari researcher named Vel Amara that was published about 3 years before the Keljuroth operation, which I read for the first time the week after. The paper is called Human Effective Extension, Scope, Mechanism, and Implications. Vel Amara's central thesis is that humans have an effective system, the system responsible for emotional attachment and bonding. That is, by the standards of any other species in the galactic database, anomalously inclusive. The system doesn't have a clear species boundary. It doesn't have a clear sentience boundary. It extends, under the right conditions, to essentially anything. Vel Amara writes, and this is the line that I've been carrying with me since I read it, human bonding appears to be less a biological function targeting specific stimuli and more a fundamental orientation toward relationship itself. Humans do not bond with things because those things meet particular biological criteria. Humans bond with things because they encounter them. Because they encounter them. A 7-year-old human child encountered a 4-meter combat organism on Keljuroth IV, and her fundamental orientation toward relationship did the thing it always does. She engaged. She treated the thing in front of her as something that could be in relationship with. Not because she assessed it and determined it was capable of relationship. Not because she had read the xenobehavioral literature and concluded that engagement was appropriate. Because she looked at it and she saw something that was having a hard time and her system did what human systems do. She walked toward it. She sat with it. She named it. Chapter 17, What Keljuroth Means. I've been asked in the months since whether the story of Keljuroth changes how we should think about the Warbeast program, whether it changes how we should think about the Yexari operation, whether it has policy implications for the GDC's management of combat-bred organisms. Those are legitimate questions. There are people better positioned than me to answer them, and they're working on it. Dr. Ohm has published 2 papers in the months since and has 3 more in progress. The xenobehavioral team has expanded significantly. There are policy discussions at levels I'll never have access to. But I don't think those are the questions that Keljuroth is really asking. I think the question Keljuroth is asking is older and simpler and harder. What are we in this universe? Not tactically. Not in terms of military capability or economic power or technological development or any of the metrics that the galactic community uses to assess and rank and categorize its member species. What are we fundamentally? What did evolution build us to do beneath all the history and the technology and the civilization? I think the answer might be this. This thing that Mara Voss did on Keljuroth IV. This walk across open ground toward a thing that everything else backs away from, because something in us cannot look at a thing in distress without moving toward it. Cannot see something isolated and not try to make contact. Cannot encounter something that is having a hard time and not try to name it, to give it a word that makes it part of our world. We domesticated the dog. We domesticated the horse. We domesticated grains and trees and water systems and entire landscapes, not because we're the strongest or the most dangerous. Because we're the ones who bond with things. Because we're the ones for whom contact is the primary mode of being in the world. Because we're the ones who, faced with the most dangerous thing in the known galaxy, send a 7-year-old child. Chapter 18, Epilogue, 6 months later. The last time I checked in with Dr. Ohm, she told me that Kale's subject Omega-9, the Warbeast of Keljuroth IV, was doing something that nobody on the behavioral team had seen before, and nobody in the Vorthon breeding records had documented. He was playing, not aggressively, not in the contextually ambiguous way that combat-trained organisms sometimes exhibit what looks like play but is actually practice behavior, genuinely playing. The GDC had, carefully and gradually, expanded the containment space around him, and within that space, he had begun doing things with objects that the behavioral monitors couldn't categorize as any known functional behavior. He was moving things, arranging them, creating configurations that the behavioral team had started calling constructions, because they weren't random and they weren't functional, and the best word for them was that they were made, in the way that something is made when a mind encounters material and turns it into something with an interior logic. Nobody knows what he's making. Dr. Ohm told me she thinks he's building something he doesn't have a word for. Something that came into existence as a concept on Keljuroth IV, during 40 minutes in the amber-colored dark with a child who talked to him like he was real. She thinks he might be building a thing like contact, or like the memory of contact, or like the waiting for it to come back. The last time I checked in with Mara Voss, she was on a resettlement station 6 systems from Keljuroth IV, attending a standard mixed-species education program and reportedly explaining to her teachers, with characteristic directness, that her first language included Galactic Standard and Keljurothian mining dialect, and also the sound a Warbeast makes when it decides you're real. Her teacher, who reported this to the education program's administrative system in a note that I somehow obtained, wrote, "Student Mara Voss continues to display significant confidence in her assessments of other species' emotional states. Assessment appears to be accurate. Uncertain how to grade this as a competency." I've been sitting with this story for 8 months. I think I know now why the words kept coming out wrong. Because the story isn't about the Warbeast and what it did. It's not even about Mara and what she did. It's about the gap between them. 15 meters of Keljuroth IV's ferrous rock in the blue-white light, with the particulate drifting through like snow that never settles. 15 meters between the most dangerous thing in the known galaxy and the smallest, most ordinary thing in the known galaxy. And the smallest thing walked across it. Not because she knew she could. Because she didn't know she couldn't. That's the thing about being human that the galaxy hasn't finished learning yet. That's the thing that 67 generations of military breeding and 11,000 years of war and 2 years of trying every available technology couldn't account for. We don't know what we can't do. And so we just keep walking forward. Into the dark, into the unknown, toward the thing that everything else runs from. Hand extended, saying the ordinary, impossible word. Sid. Filed by Galactic Tribune correspondent Jenny's Aura, 7 months after the events described. The reporter's full case files, interview recordings, and supplementary documentation are archived with the Tribune and remain available to verified research institutions upon application. Subject Omega-9, designation Kale, remains in GDC care. As of the date of this filing, Dr. Sevri Ohm has been appointed permanent behavioral integration lead for his ongoing care. Mara Voss, age 7, is doing well.